Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Raven. My guest today is Janet L. Polach. She is a global leadership development partner and coach. She's developed leaders in the US and in many countries, many continents around the world. She's a retired lieutenant colonel, having served and spent 20 years in the Marines. So Janet knows a thing or two about what it takes to be a great leader, and we're going to explore that here today. So before I tell you a little bit more about Janet, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Thank you so much, Mark. It's a delight to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you, and we'll hear your story. And I want to talk about your book. Janet is the author of a book titled The 7 Mistakes Managers Make. So you can understand. So Janet's in the right place. She's received her Ph.D. in organizational development. She worked with a global consulting firm in China. After doing so, she launched her own consulting practice, helping hundreds of companies around the globe, including major brands and government contractors. And Janet's bio says she describes a no-nonsense approach. Maybe that sounds like what we might expect from the Marine Corps, but also a lighthearted approach in what separates her. That's part of what separates her from the boys. And as she puts it, and creates transformational results for even the most struggling leaders. So again, the book is The 7 Mistakes Managers Make, and Janet's website is www.inthelead.co, and there will be links in the show notes. It would be a mistake to do.com. So again, it's inthelead.co. So Janet, there's so much I want to ask you about from your experiences, and even from some of the colorful language in your bio there. But we're going to dive in as we normally do here, if you would. Thinking of the different things you've done, what is your favorite mistake?
Well, my favorite mistake happened when I got back from China. My husband and I spent 3 wonderful years living and working there. I got a chance to work for Korn Ferry International, which is really one of the leading leadership development firms around the world, and got to work with, an amazing suite of Fortune 50 companies around Asia. And so I was hired to build out a leadership curriculum for a company here in Minneapolis, and came on board and had some conversations with senior leadership about, how robust do you want the program? Do you want world-class, or do you want something that's pretty solid? Because, world-class programs take a lot of resource. And they said, no, we want world-class, give us all you got. And so I spent the next several months working with an incredible designer, and we put the program together. And the people that were working on the logistics side just didn't hold up their end of the bargain. We had a couple speakers that never got scheduled. We had people that got invited at the very last minute. We had materials that weren't ready. And at one point, I finally said to this person that I was working with, she and I didn't really hit things off when we first came together in the first place. I finally told her how disappointed I was. I pretty much lost my patience and lost my temper. And there, unfortunately, were 3 or 4 people around me at the time. It was a really bad experience. Needless to say, I am no longer with that organization. And but here's what I learned. What I learned is, first of all, some people just aren't made to work together. I do this in a lot of my coaching work. I work on dyad relationships, and sometimes, that gap just can't be filled. The other thing I learned is fit matters when you go to work for an organization. 3 months into this job, I lasted, I think, about 2 years, but 3 months in, I was shaking my head like, oh, this is not the right place for me. They're not in a very challenging industry. They're not globally oriented. And so it was a struggle all along. And I probably had seen the signs as I came on board, but was excited for the job and excited for the challenge. So we live and learn, don't we, Mark?
We all live, we all make mistakes. And, as we encourage here on My Favorite Mistake, hopefully we are learning from those mistakes. And, from that story, it seems like there's a lot to unpack there. First off, it sounds like, that they in that moment of giving that feedback or getting upset, that was more of a no nonsense moment for you.
It was a no nonsense moment for me because the lack of follow through did make me look bad. When you have a program that you're running and the speaker doesn't show up, you have time to fill, it's a problem. And when you're the face to the program, it's a difficult one to deal with. And yet, giving any kind of constructive feedback in front of a group is really never appropriate. I talk about it in my book, the keys to giving effective feedback. And at the top of the list is do it in private.
Right. There's kind of an old rule there. I've heard it said as praise publicly and criticize privately.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, that came through in your retelling of the story. I'm curious, from your 20 years in the Marines, was that practiced in terms of praise publicly, criticize privately? Like, I don't have any military experience of my own, but the stereotype of military, let's say, boot camp, and this could be just Hollywood nonsense, is being criticized in front of others all the time. I'm curious, what was the leadership style in the Marines?
Very public criticism, at least during those first several months of your induction, whether you go to officer candidate school or you go to boot camp, what you see on television is a lot what you get. And it's all part of the shtick, I would say, of the style of the U.S. military, which is kind of break people down from their old habits and then start to build them up. So by the time you become a second lieutenant or a lance corporal or a corporal, there's a lot. It's pretty uncommon to get called out in a very public environment. I do think that most Marine officers, work at sharing that same adage about criticize privately.
Yeah, so there's difference. There's difference perhaps in the more professional environment, maybe amongst officers. There's a different dynamic there than there would be during induction.
I think so. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you say, that's more of a dynamic you would expect in any workplace, let's say peer to peer or giving feedback to an employee. Yeah.
I think, Mark, there's probably one exception to that. And it fits so closely into our military experience, which is when there's a safety issue involved. If someone is doing something that's unsafe, or on the battlefield, they're making a decision that just is not prudent and will put others in risk, that's when all constructive feedback guidelines go out the window. Right. It's always safety first.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. And I've seen that modeled by leaders in different settings, including manufacturing, of, leaders whose default mode would be to ask questions and to stay calm. And like, if they see somebody with their safety glasses on top of their head, they may lose it momentarily, but for good reason. And maybe it's the urgency of the matter. But I'm curious to hear your reflections, like in that story that you told. Not the words you used, but it sounds like you lost your cool a little bit in the moment. I'm curious your reflections on that, and when faced with a frustration or a disappointment today, how do you react to things?
I think I've learned, you learn what your triggers are, and in my case, this particular coworker was a trigger. I couldn't count on her for follow through. I know she was talking about me and my style behind my back. And so it was a relationship that was probably doomed to end sooner than later. But, I think anytime even talking about this makes me uncomfortable. It was one of my worst moments professionally. It's never okay to share your own frustration on top of somebody else, and when you're in a public setting particularly. I did apologize after the fact, and I think that's important. That's really about the only thing that we can do when we lose our temper is once cooler heads prevail. In my book, I talk about giving feedback, and I encourage people not to do it in the moment, because you might get caught up in that frustration and your own emotions, to let some time settle in on both parties. But again, thinking about as a mistake, it's not one I'm certainly not proud of that moment.
Well, I appreciate you being willing to share the story and to talk about that, Janet. One other question about the story and the scenario that you told. You mentioned, 3 months in, you felt like this wasn't a good fit. And I've had other guests, there's always that challenge of, it could be a mistake of leaving a job too quickly, or it could end up being the opposite of looking back and saying the mistake was maybe sticking with it too long. I'm curious your reflections on, would it have been a mistake to leave after 3 months? Did you feel an obligation to try to fix things?
Yes, I think we do, right? As we're hired as senior professionals, we do feel an urge to fix things, that maybe I'm not reading this correctly. Maybe it's not as bad as I see it in the situation. And so you do kind of hang in there. What I tell people, though, when I interact with a lot of people, I'm sure, Mark, as you do, who are job looking, I tell them to be very mindful of the red flags, because they're, I worked for one of the large consulting companies many years ago. And in that hiring process, there were many red flags, including the partner canceling the interview after I had arrived. Yeah, because he was too busy and he didn't get it on his calendar. And, I should never have taken that job. And so I think the bigger mistake sometimes is being lulled into thinking, oh, well, it won't be that bad, or I'm misreading the situation, or I can make it better. But I think in the interview process, if you hear red flags, you're probably right.
Yeah. And there's that question of, do you follow your gut? Or if we're thinking of reasons to accept the job and reasons to not accept it, where do we find that balance? Those are not easy decisions, for sure.
No. And they certainly have a lot to do with what's your personal situation. How desperate are you for that job? How long have you been out of work, or are you leaving? What situation are you leaving? So it is very much variable on the individual situation.
Yeah. So again, our guest is Janet Polach. Her book is The 7 Mistakes Managers Make. Before we talk about the book and talk more about leadership and mistakes that you've seen and that you write about, back to your bio, we talk about, no nonsense. That seems to be, again, like the model we think of with the Marines. It's a serious mission. It's serious responsibility. Where did you, or why do you think it's important to also have a lighthearted approach? Was that just kind of part of your nature and personality?
I think it is part of my nature. And what I learned in the Marine Corps is that you really can be yourself, even when you're in an organization that has a very strong persona. And many organizations across the planet have that same thing, whether you're in healthcare or you're an airline pilot or what have you. There are expectations about how we act, but I think you can also find a way to bring yourself to that environment. If I spill milk on the floor in my kitchen, I usually laugh about it, because you can either get angry or you can say, oh my gosh, I have a big mess. Like, how did that happen? And so my natural tendency is to not laugh at people, but to laugh with people and say, there are a lot of things in this country, in this world, that could be a lot worse. And this does not measure up to that catastrophe in the moment.
Yeah. And I guess one other question, I'm curious about your time in the Marine Corps. What percentage of officers at your level or above were women? I imagine it was a pretty small number.
It is small. So pretty much consistently, the U.S. Marine Corps has had about 10% of its ranks as women. That did change during the first Desert Storm in Iraq. We took our women along. We always kind of scratched our heads like, if we get deployed, what are we going to do? And the answer was, everybody's going, so bring them along. Mm-hmm. And what happened in several cases is that women just performed admirably. Mm-hmm. They knew their jobs, they did it, they didn't complain. If there was a physical lift involved, they literally pulled their weight. And after that, then things really changed for women in the U.S. military. Mm-hmm. And while our life plan is very rarely defined, and we, most of us aren't able to go from step 1 to 2 to 3 as we played out. But I could not have been more fortunate at the time I joined the Marine Corps, because everything changed for women in the 20 years that I was in. When I was a second lieutenant, I would have bet you anything that we would not have women helicopter pilots. Because they were combat, all of our helicopters are combat-oriented aircraft, and yet we have helicopter pilots. I remember the day probably 10 years ago when the first woman helicopter pilot died in combat. It was a tough day for me. She happened to be from Minnesota, and I did reach out to the family to try to remind them that their daughter was doing what she loved, and that this kind of came with the territory, but it was still really difficult to see that, hear about that happen, which is, on the one hand, this is something we worked so hard for, but on the other side, there's a real dark side to getting what you ask for.
Yeah. And times have changed. I mean, again, this is, pointing to Hollywood, but the 36 years between the original Top Gun movie and the new Top Gun Maverick. In the original, women were there for Tom Cruise to flirt with, and
this time they're in the lead.
There was one female fighter pilot in the new movie. More reflecting more diversity and reflecting how the military has changed.
Yeah.
So back to the book. On the 7 mistakes managers make. I'm curious, as you're starting to go from idea to book, framing. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on framing things around a book about leadership mistakes or management mistakes, as opposed to a book that says, here's the 7 things you should do.
Yeah. Well, that was my editor's suggestion. I said, I'm really stuck on a title. And she said, I think books that talk about things that you want to avoid rather than the things that you do are probably a little bit more interesting. It was The 7 Mistakes was a COVID book. Things the first 6 months of COVID went just fine for me. I continued my coaching and my leadership development, and we transitioned, to virtual. But the last of that first year, the last 6 months were a little bit slower. And I had on my to-do list to write a book. And so I looked back through my content, and surprisingly, I had written about this a lot already. I had presentations, I had facilitator guides, I had blog posts. And so the book kind of came together nicely. Why 7 mistakes? There could be. I've talked to a lot of people who will say, oh, my boss made 142 just yesterday. And sadly, we've all worked for really bad managers. And I think the reason is because we don't train brand new managers. We spend a lot of money developing leaders, but we usually do it at the very top of the organizations. We promote people because they're really good individual contributors. And so we think they can be good managers when in fact, those skills don't overlap very much. And so from the conference board, get this, the average individual in the United States is promoted to manager somewhere between age 29 and 31, and they don't get their first management development experience until their mid-40s.
Wow.
So we're all feeling that with bad managers. People are leaving because of them. They get so busy trying to run their department that they forget it's the people that will create their success. And
Right.
so I hope the book really gives new managers and experienced managers an opportunity to think about, here's what good looks like.
Mhm.
I don't have to do all 7 things every day. I don't have to avoid every single one every day. But here are some of the baseline skills for being a really great manager of other people.
And I certainly recognize those mistakes, those failure modes that you describe. I've seen it in manufacturing. I've seen it in healthcare. Of the trap of taking the best individual contributor and assuming that they'll be a great manager. And then the second mistake that often compounds if you've selected poorly, the lack of investment, the lack of training, the lack of coaching. Managers above that frontline manager are busy, and they don't. If the organization doesn't expect that a big part of their job is teaching and coaching the leaders below them, that just creates all sorts of dysfunction, to say the least.
It does. It does. And I think organizations don't know how to tackle the problem because, of course, there's a lot more frontline leaders than there are vice presidents. And so, how do you invest in all of these managers as they're new to the management rank? And it doesn't have to be hours and hours and days of training. What we learned, I think, in spades during COVID is we can do a couple-hour session in a virtual environment and talk about the basics of giving feedback, about setting performance expectations, about managing change. We can do that over the course of, 5 or 6 weeks with an interaction every, once a week, and kind of get those standards built up.
Yeah. And I can imagine, I'm curious your experience with this, the data you pointed to of, let's say somebody is in a management, or they've progressed through management roles for at least a decade before they're now at a level where the organization deems them worthy of this investment. Like that sort of that sink or swim dynamic could lead to people. Like, are people swimming, or are they staying above water by stepping on others? Like, what habits have they developed on their own? Like, how much of that can actually be, if need be, trained out of somebody?
I had a manager in a session the other day. She'd been a manager for 4 years. And I said to the group, what are your one-on-one likes? What are your one-on-one meetings like? Mm-hmm. And she said, well, Janet, I don't really do them because I don't know what I talk about. So imagine that, and she was a very caring person. She really wanted to do well by her employees. But I think managers who've got no background in how to manage, or, haven't had good role models, are just figuring out. And so she said, I talk to my people all the time. I ask them what they're working on, and we talk about status. And I say, is there anything I can do to get you unstuck? But that's not really a good one-on-one. She wasn't aware what their career aspirations were. She didn't have a sense about what they really loved about their job and where they really struggled. And so I do think, Mark, we can train out some of these old habits once we set the expectation that this is what good looks like.
Right. Caring about your people, not just the work and the results, is what I hear you saying.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think what you just said, caring about the people as much as at work, is what's at the core, what's at the center of this great resignation, or, the great rethinking, as some people have said. Employees are learning because they're leaving because they're not appreciated. They're working longer and longer days because people have left, and they aren't having quality interactions with their managers, and so they feel like just a cog in the wheel.
Yeah. One data point you point to, one number that you point to, Janet, is $166 billion spent every year on leadership training. And, you've pointed out that gap where a lot of people aren't getting it in their first decade or so. I mean, do you think there's more of that money that's wasted because the training is not even solid, yet alone world class? Is the training being aimed at the wrong people?
I think it's both and. I
Mhm.
think we're not investing in our brand new managers in those first 2, 3, 4 years of management experience. I think we may be spending, and I shouldn't say this because I'm also an executive coach. I
Right.
think we're maybe spending too much money at the top of the house. Yes,
Mhm.
those challenges are significant and we need our leaders to be strategic. And yet, if you took the price of one coaching engagement and said, what could I do with those dollars, and redirected it towards the bottom of the house, what would your turnover situation be like?
Mhm.
What would your intention be like? What would your employee engagement scores look like?
Yeah. So when you talk about the different, or if we think about the different ways somebody might learn about leadership, I'm curious your experience from the Marine Corps of, how much of the leadership expectations and behave in terms of what they do and how they do it. How much of that was, let's say, classroom training? How much of it was just behaviors were modeled by officers above you? How much of it was through coaching?
Yeah. So I would say a lot of it is classroom training,
Mhm.
and it's months and months long. As a brand new captain, you go to something in the Marine Corps Amphibious Warfare School, and it's 9 months long,
Mm.
every single day. And so there's an inordinate amount of training that happens in the military. Every single day, troops go out to the field and practice tactics and fire on the ranges. And so learning how to work together. But of course, then their superior, whoever that is with the group, is giving them feedback, is talking about what went well and what didn't go so well. So it's really built in, I think, to the backbone of the United States military, the
Mhm.
Marine Corps being who I was involved in. And it's really what gave me my underpinnings of what does good leadership look like.
Mhm.
The military also uses a single performance review that hasn't changed in years, and it's all about leadership. That once you're a non-commissioned officer, a corporal in the Marine Corps, you are assessed on your leadership skills. And so they live and breathe leadership in every aspect of what the military does. And I do think civilian organizations can do the same thing.
Mhm.
So many organizations keep redoing their performance review. People aren't doing it, so they make it shorter. It's too short, so they make it long. They do it quarterly, but it's just as long. And really, it's about having conversations with employees about what matters to you, what gets you excited about this job, what else do you want to
Mhm.
learn? And imagine if you have those conversations at least on a monthly basis with employees, they're going to, even if they're doing the most mundane work, they are still going to be engaged because they're engaged with each other. They're engaged with the people that they work with. They are getting their cup filled from their manager.
Yeah. I love the way you articulated that. And yeah, I mean, I was it's a little surprising. I mean, I wouldn't have expected as much classroom training. I would have thought it would have been
Yep.
more field based or more feedback or
Mm-hmm.
coaching based. But what I hear you describing, I could see where, theory,
Mm-hmm.
book learning, if you will,
Yep.
the classroom education would only get you so far if it was not followed up
Yeah.
with field practice and coaching and feedback. It seems like sometimes organizations, they say, well, the classroom training is a waste of time. You're going to learn by doing. That could be
Yeah.
ineffective. Knowledge or theory only could also be
Yeah.
ineffective.
Well, and I think the military does that really well of doing theory to practice. So that 9-month program I described is probably, I don't know, let me just guess, 20 or 30% actually in a classroom. And then the classroom is taken outside and tactics are run. Exercises are done. And so there is, you're absolutely right, Mark. It is then application with, of course, feedback, instructors and individuals who are critiquing how things went.
And there's, I think, a parallel in healthcare. Clinicians who get a lot of classroom knowledge, and then they go out
Mhm.
and do their practical education, their clinicals, whether it's a nurse or it's a doctor, is a resident. And I've heard, like, especially in nursing, there are concerns that as the amount of classroom knowledge, the need for that has expanded, it's squeezed out the
Mhm.
practical and the clinicals. And so that means organizations have to adjust in terms of how
Yes.
they're continuing some of that education that they might have assumed was already there.
Yeah. And in healthcare, it's a challenge because we're already short staff.
Mhm.
And so thinking about how do I build training or development into a day-to-day, a day in, day out, it's a difficult thing to think about. And yet it can be built in. We know that the most effective learning happens on the job, right in the flow of work. And yet it takes a deliberate effort to say, all right, we're going to spend 30 minutes in your shift today learning something new or teaching what you know to someone else, which is really just as instructive and as developmental as a course sitting in a classroom.
Mhm. And so there's this leadership development, and then there's broader organizational change that I know you focus on. People will use the phrase change management.
Mhm.
So you talk about the need to fully engage people, to excite people about change. Are there, and this could be an and answer, mistakes made in how leaders go about quote unquote change management, or just a lack of emphasis on proper change management?
I think sometimes they just don't know how to manage a change.
Mhm.
And there's nothing special or magic about managing a change. It's finding out what people are worried about, finding out how we're going to get them ready, and then deploying a plan.
Mhm.
Um, I think that the attitude that the manager has about the change makes a big difference.
Mm.
If she is talking about, oh, we tried this 5 years ago, it didn't work then, I don't know why we're trying it again, this is going to be a lot more work for us, that change is probably dead on arrival.
Right.
But if the manager can understand what's behind the change, what's the rationale, are we saving money, are we saving steps, are we increasing quality, and it really embrace what is behind that, and then help the staff understand. So here's what's going to happen. There's going to be a downside while you learn how to do this new thing. We're going to learn from each other. We get a chance to refine the process as we learn, and we're in this together. That kind of attitude is going to get that change much more successfully implemented than, here we go again.
Yeah. I think there's different mindsets. There's the here's why it's not going to work negativity. And then there's the here's what we would do to make it work positivity.
Yeah.
There's two sides of that same coin of there are going to be challenges. And what I hear you saying is be honest about that. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't deny it.
Absolutely.
Sounds like an element of just be honest with people.
I think so. Because sometimes, managers are in two camps around change. One is they initiate it themselves. Maybe there's too many mistakes. Maybe there's too much turnover. Maybe there's too much whatever. And so they initiate a change. But at least half the time, they get a change sent down to them. Corporate did it to us again, and this is going to make sense. And maybe from a corporation perspective, that change does make a lot of sense. But I think a good manager, and I talk about this in the book, and I spend a whole chapter on how do you effectively manage a change, regardless of whether you're introducing a change yourself or the change is coming from above.
And I'm curious to hear your reaction. I mean, a pet peeve of mine is when, let's say there's a lack of change management, and then leaders blame the people who aren't accepting change. That really irritates me. Or the nails on the chalkboard phrase to me is like, oh, well, they're resistant to change.
They're not resistant to change. They're unknowledgeable about the change. If you suddenly came to a group and said, okay, now we're going to turn right, and you gave them no explanation about why we're going to turn right, what happens when we turn right, What happens if we don't turn right? And so it's all of that background and perspective and perspective setting that's required in managing a change that busy managers don't necessarily pause and take time to say, all right, now how do I craft this message? Not as a Pollyanna, because I don't think, Mark, that's what we're talking about. I think it's being very realistic, but taking time to get the background about what's driving this and why is it driving it now.
So Janet, maybe one other question, something you mentioned earlier, giving feedback, and there's certainly more in the book. I'm curious if you have advice or if there's a mistake, if you want to frame it that way, a mistake that's often made if someone's trying to give feedback up to their boss or to somebody a couple levels up. Are there things to look out for, be careful about, do or not do if you're trying to give feedback upward, especially let's say if it's unsolicited?
Right. I think first of all, prepare. Good feedback describes the impact. It describes the behavior, it describes the impact, and then it's forward looking. So taking even a minute to say, what is the purpose of my feedback? What's the behavior that's getting in the way? What's the impact that behavior's had? And what would I like to see you do differently instead next time? Because, it doesn't do us any good to plow old ground. Right? Like you did this and you did that and you did this and you did that. That suddenly creates defensiveness. So I think number one, prepare. I think number two, finding a time where just you and your boss are together. And maybe it's just finding 15 minutes on their calendar to tee up the issue. Trying to give feedback at the end of a meeting because you finally have 3 minutes is probably not going to be effective. But I think starting very frankly with, I'd like to give you some feedback, is now a good time. And usually that creates enough of a curiosity in the other person. And whether the person accepts the feedback or not is not your issue. Your issue is to deliver it in a professional way. And whether the person takes that on or not is up to them. I do a lot of 360 assessments, and often, not often, but every once in a while, about 10, 15% of the time, it's some really difficult feedback. This person is domineering, they cut people off, they think they're the smartest person in the room. And my job then is to deliver this feedback. And many times, I would say almost all the time with this kind of individual, they say, I've never heard this before. And sadly, I have to say to them, well, you didn't hear it because you wouldn't let it be heard. You cut them off, you were defensive, and the person just said, forget it. I tried, I'm going to move on. So I do think, the critical side of feedback, the constructive side of feedback needs to be said, but we all need to be open to that. Nobody wants to hear constructive feedback. But boy, oh boy, if I'm doing something that my team doesn't find productive, I'd sure rather hear about it than have them just plain leave.
And it sounds like it's probably not a mistake for leaders to ask their employees occasionally, do you have any feedback for me? Absolutely. Yeah. Teams that have, the Franklin Covey has done a bit of research on this, and they've discovered that teams that engage in regular feedback, both constructive and redirecting feedback, are much more effective as teams than the ones that just don't create that habit. Because then, otherwise, feedback is suddenly, oh my gosh, there's a huge problem, rather than next time, why don't you pause after you present your point of view and let other people weigh in? Yeah. And what do you mean by redirecting feedback? Redirecting is, here's what I'd like you to do instead. Okay. Here's what you could do next time. Yeah. Looking forward instead of just looking back at what wasn't ideal in the past. Right. Yeah. Well, again, our guest today has been Janet Polach. Her book is The 7 Mistakes Managers Make. And a final question for you, Janet. You had mentioned when we talked before that there was a book or books you had started, you had attempted What I'd be
Yep.
curious to hear about that.
So 7 mistakes is my third attempt. And so not every time you'll need to be successful. And all 3 were after I wrote my dissertation. So I am used to writing in bulk. But the second one that I did was about I'm sorry. And I started about 3 or 4 years ago because there was this, it was about when Me Too was coming around. And we heard these stories, from high profile individuals who always use the word if in their apology. If I offended anybody, well, you're being sued, buddy. Of course you offended someone.
Right.
And so I took on to try to, what is a good framework for apologizing to someone else? And I got stuck because I reached out to friends and said, do you have a story about when you apologized or when you were apologized to, and how did that go? And sadly, I just didn't get enough stories. And Mark, when you and I first connected, I was so delighted that you've got this podcast that focuses on mistakes, because that's fundamental to apologizing, is that I have admitted I've done something wrong, and I've done something wrong to someone else, and I want to make it better. And so I learned in the book writing experience that, all books don't have to be completed. Maybe that I'm sorry book will rear its ugly head again in another couple of years, and the stories will start flooding in.
Well, as you often see with entrepreneurs and others who've been on the podcast, success often comes out of, something successful. In this case, a successfully completed and published book. Congratulations for that. It often comes in the follow-up to attempts that didn't go as well, one way or another.
Yes.
So,
absolutely,
a good story of perseverance, and I'd like to think it's a podcast about learning from mistakes, and part of that is admitting the mistakes. So Janet, thank you for your graciousness and your willingness to share the story, and more importantly, what you learned from it and your reflections here today. I really do appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Mark. This was really a delight and my pleasure.
So again, Janet Polach, her website is inthelead.co. Her book is The 7 Mistakes Managers Make. I encourage you to check that out. There'll be links, of course, in the show notes. So Janet, thank you. Thanks again for being here today.
Thank you so much, Mark.